Starting recording.
I can see you all now, which is great.
Let's see.
I much prefer it when I can see
Oh,
you.
I can only see Jamie, of all people. Only Jamie.
I know, Jesus.
All right, recording. It says recording now. All right, so we're here with Owen Southgate, coach mentor for the FA, head of NYFA, National Youth Football Association.
Indeed.
Just overall guru of football. And
yeah, I'd class myself more of a jack of all trades, and that's my guru. But I can kind of maybe take that like in another 20 years, maybe. I'll have that title in 20 years. I'll take that. No, cool. Hi, everybody. Hi.
Yeah, so that's the intro that we neglected last time. But yeah, we just kind of let the conversation flow, I guess.
Cool beans.
And I think, Owen, you're speaking about football and, kind of as it is reflective of life.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, you were just kind of highlighting the previous conversations, obviously, on the previous video. I think, in a nutshell, the dynamism and mirroring between both the game and life is pretty much there for everybody to see. I think the really interesting point when it comes to the competence of coaching within that dynamic is the ability to see that detail, not just the detail on the tactical level or strategic level. It's kind of seeing all of the detail that can be applied on many learning fronts, be it existential, spiritual, obviously to be attached to that, all the way through to holding yourself authentically to a set of diverse values or values that you hold, be it human or capitalistic or whatever the case may be. It's when you kind of got all those things rolling around, obviously it's just going to be as fluidic and dynamic as it should be. And I think that's the beauty in reality when it comes to coaching, is that ultimately the coach really has no power apart from the capacity to facilitate, and that facilitation ultimately kind of rolls through what kind of values that individual holds in terms of how they apply practice. And that's it. If I kind of really dig deep into my experiences of mentoring, it literally is about being able to roll up to every coach that I've spent time with and work out the reasons for why they want to coach in the first place. Then kind of going, okay, well, centrally to that, you're now supporting the growth and development of other people. So where do your values sit with that now? Yeah. And then you kind of then obviously spend a lot of time trying to synchronize those values to what we hold dear as humans. So we're kind of looking at, again, what that existential view is, and ultimately how we want to be motivated and driven by that energy. So it's So that's kind of.
So I've always picked up from you a strong emphasis kind of on person-centered or maybe holistic, whatever kind of approach.
Yeah.
But I guess let's jump right into it. How do you see, having been, an FA and mentoring coaches for a while, how do you see, there's been a lot of developments in kind of the science, a lot of it very empirical and research-based in terms of skill acquisition and these kind of things. How do you see that relationship unfolding with the day-to-day practice of coaching?
I think to kind of look at all of those angles, especially in around skill ac, it's kind of connecting it really to what I perceive is probably one of the most fundamental truths within sport, and that's the attention towards creativity, especially when it comes to divergent thinking or lateral thinking. So the really interesting thing for me, and it's the reason why Mark I hold quite dear, is the non-linear kind of pedagogy, that kind of is applied under his banner. It really kind of does tick a few boxes in relation to again how dynamic the environment should be, to then what you can really draw out of on a concentrated level, especially in and around creativity and divergence. And I think that means that Skillac kind of takes a completely different point of view. It becomes much more organic in its form, and again, it's then down to the principal details of the game itself to be the teacher, and then for the coach within their own right to then see those details and let them unfold. not explicitly apply the process, but allow it to be implicit within its form, but facilitated at the same time. And that's kind of what I've obviously spending my time with the FA, kind of floating around both grassroots and pro circles. You kind of get you kind of get a vibe of what's right and what's wrong. And for a long time, the scene has been systematically wrong in its application of things like skill act, because ultimately explicitly applying all of that knowledge really doesn't really give that individual that you're focusing your time on any real opportunity to apply it in context, and that's the main issue. Coaches have been applying themselves to explicitly deliver, and actually taking all of that wonderful kind of organic gooey center that kind of comes from participating in sport out of the equation. And I think that's kind of where I see it. You can kind of see that the industry is changing. People are becoming much more aware, as you say. There's a huge amount of research now going on out there in order to get a better understanding of how people learn, from metacognition to communities of practice, those kinds of things. They're all now rolling through. Even Dweck, her focus on growth mindset. They're all now coming to the fore, and you're now starting to see a lot of budding coaches really come through and do a lot of digging into understanding what it actually means to engage other human beings in learning. So there you go. I hope I answered that.
Hi, a couple of things that pop up when you're speaking there. One of the first thing, maybe something to do with the coach not having power, maybe in some sense, and also this game being the teacher. Things unfold, right? They emerge, that kind of thing. And I think that's all. Yeah, I'm very interested in this idea as well. This emergence, this ecological approach. Maybe it's called something like that.
That's a better way of saying it.
Right, and but then I wonder, there's something I wrestle with, and I think about if it is just the game that is the teacher, this objective thing called the game that is the teacher, then where does that leave you, like stylistically, in terms of different coaches? Maybe it's different cultures, maybe it's not just individual coaches, but I think certainly individual coaches as well interpret their own version, if you like, of football, and then are interested in trying to apply that. And I think this is one of the reasons why you get stylistic differences within football. And I wonder about if it's just left to things emerging from the objective game, whether that brings around a sort of more homogeneity, right? A more just a singular thing. Everyone plays the same way, right? Just do the right things that you should do in football, and you play football. But then I think, well, is football one thing, or is it actually a load of different interpretations? Which is then an interesting thing, perhaps.
Absolutely. Well, I think you kind of, that's a really good throwback, because I think the thing for me is that there has to be a balance between what we understand as the principles of the game, for example, and the interpretation of those relative to the authenticity of not only the game but the individual that's applying within it. And I think in that notion, again, coming back to the notion of the game being the teacher, I think for clever coaches out there, for coaches who really are kind of taking a very, very deep and thoughtful approach to it, there are ways of being able to facilitate practice in order to enhance the learning journey, to kind of get the details out. So TGFU, for example, teaching games for understanding, that approach is a really, really good way of kind of getting children as an example to explore their environment on an ecological level and still get learning outcomes that coaches are after. It's just understanding, I think, from a learning perspective, what learning actually is and where it actually comes from as a point of substance. And what when it comes to even just playing the game, if we're now going to take the connotation of performance into account, how do we get better performances out of individuals as they go and apply themselves within the game format? And it's a very obvious and very, very straightforward thing to say, but it's much, much better to have a group of individuals who can all collectively think for themselves as an individual, as a group, than have a coach kind of spend their time 90 minutes shouting at them. And I obviously think we know that within the context of learning for children, the whole notion of motivation, being an active part of a group, having a sense of belonging, having the intention and the interactions associated with all of that are much better if it's coming from their internal perspective rather than external. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because you got these absolutely this idea of like collective alignment of perspective, this idea of group thinking, collective intelligence, right? Very, very interesting, very cool. But the thing is, as well, so you say like the words like better outcomes, so it's better according to some thing, right? So where there's always a goal. So whatever heuristic you put in that you would like the players to adhere to, behavior wise. So again, we get back to that question of, is there a set thing about football you should always want players to do? Right? For example, like pass forward or something like that, because you seem to get different versions of this game. And it's like, well, some would say, I want lots of short passes here. Some would say, no, I don't want so many short passes here. I want them over here, right? And so there's various. I think there are clearly things that we can all say is good football, right? Move it towards the opponent's goal rather than I think there are like objective things. Then I wonder where that line is. Maybe there is. I don't think there is a line. Personally speaking, I think there is a room for individual interpretation to then put for the coach to put some of their own heuristics into the group, and then trying to teach those heuristics that might be different from another coach, for example.
Well, I can only kind of roll off of my vision of what I would like to see within the ecological development of an environment within sport, and that's value, human-centered value, values that are kind of associated to much more of an existential, or even kind of not so much religious, but maybe even more of a spiritual perspective. I think just the capacity to be kind of nice to each other and understand the values associated to that should then fuel the platform in a way in which they then have a collective idea about why they're there in the first place. But then you kind of bolt on all of the associate parts, including skill act, for example, as a notion towards the obtained goal or the focused goal.
Okay, so the highest goal is maybe something more in what you're sort of the idea you're speaking about. The highest goal is maybe something more human than actually just winning football games or something. Yeah, sure.
Well, this is really interesting to me because from an applied perspective, we spoke a little bit about it with Arthur last time, but and I have this feeling as a youth coach, you see your players for maybe 2 hours a week or 3 hours a week. How much time is that needed to be spent on developing them as footballers versus developing them as people? Because that would impact, how you would apply your training. And especially if you are educated from somebody like World Football Academy, where it's about this hyper efficiency and using all of your time to develop. But then, how much of that should be spent on developing the person versus their footballing ability? So from an applied perspective.
Well, the whole issue is in and around understanding the limitations associated to a capital kind of approach to a group. If you're now looking at the World Football Academy, and it's Verheyen, I think it is, it's really interesting. I've taken some really deep-seated conversations with coaches in Sweden who follow the model, and I'm never ever going to agree or disagree to it, because for me, it's there's always going to again be interpretation to a model like that, and ultimately how it's then applied. But there is, when you commodify an individual as a unit of energy within the construct of a group for the result of a game, for example, that takes away a huge amount of emphasis and opportunity for learning that actually could enhance further the performance of that individual, not only within the short but the long term. And that for me kind of then highlights a model like that to be just, as I say, a little bit limiting. And in reality, actually, as adults or as custodians of knowledge and wisdom on a much wider perspective, that time taken with the children that you work with is an opportunity to engage them in embracing much more through our wonderful platform the visions and views of the world. And again, if you add more, I see it as adding value. Every time I get an opportunity to add more value, be it from the person-centered perspective or the performance-centered perspective, I'm going to try and do it. And I actually, though this is subjective on my part, most of the time, or most if not all of the time that I've applied that kind of attitude to my environment, I've actually got the best performances out of my group anyway, because they buy into the fact that I care for them and to a degree, obviously love them on an appropriate level to invest my time and energy and wisdom into making them feel better as humans and as players. And ultimately, that's received back in the way that they walk on the pitch and work hard for themselves and for each other and for me. And that's the same if I work with a group of coaches who are on a tutor course with the FA, or I just recently went to the Philippines and had the same experience going out there working with coaches for NYFA. So it's
a false dichotomy, maybe, right? People think performance means hyper efficiency, but maybe performance is also because you're developing the person. Yeah, that's interesting.
Absolutely. Well, people have got to be motivated. People have got to be motivated, and the only way that you really only get them motivated is if they internalize it to the degree in which that internalization becomes something much, much deeper than application on surface level. And I think that's. I hope I'm making sense, but that's kind of the reasons why I struggle with living in society in general, really, because we are unfortunately kind of all being corralled to that kind of more capitalist, more materialistic form, which sadly is the thing that I think a lot of coaches battle against massively in getting the kids to even go out on the pitch. And second of all, that's even more of a reason for why coaches should spend those 2 hours a week with their kids engaging on those kinds of social levels, because the majority of the time kids aren't going to have access to that kind of depth, and that's important.
So I think just to kind of know in the context of our conversations and my conversations with you as well, kind of to sum up, I think what we're exploring a little bit is like, you have the maybe let's call it just a general, more ecological or nonlinear kind of perspective, and then we're looking at I would say vision. What's the role of vision for the coach, or the coaches? Because obviously one of the big outcomes of the nonlinear thing is like it's opposed to the idea of the coach coming in and kind of playing chess with the players and utterly imposing a vision of the game onto the players as just these little pawns, right? But there's something that's kind of almost like a paradoxical thing where even if you're coming in and saying, all right, I'm completely like organic, ecological, you're still imposing that vision onto the environment. So it becomes almost unavoidable. But then what we're wondering is like, yes, for sure, in the given state of world football, most coaches probably definitely need to hear more about taking a step back, more organic learning processes, and having a more facilitating as opposed to directing and kind of just putting everything down and all these kind of steps and stuff. But at some point, do we have to reintroduce the role of vision in coaching? Because I think what we're wondering is like, is it just unavoidable? And if we maybe kind of demonize it, does it end up coming back around and biting you in the butt somehow?
Well, I don't know if you guys have got an answer to this, but for me, that I think if you looked at the history of coaching or sport in particular, especially within football, is a very easy one to see. You can see the constant revolution and rehashing of these things as it happens. And there's a book out there called Inverting the Pyramid, which is a great book of tactics and understanding the game from the very, very first time England and Scotland met to what we're looking at maybe sort of 10 years ago when Barcelona first stepped on the scene. And you're going to see that constant flux between the explicit and the implicit and the direct. And it's, I think the really interesting thing now is I think we really are coming to a focal point of understanding and learning more than ever, and digging much deeper into understanding that process as it goes. But again, I would always kind of roll it back for me personally to understanding why it is I'm coaching in the first place, and then how that within its own right then allows the individuals within my environment to really take ownership. That environment ultimately is not for me. So I'm there as the custodian of certain pieces of information that allow these individuals to apply themselves within the context of the environment and the sport itself. But ultimately, I'm just a facilitator, and I think the way that I engage myself in that is that I want first-hand experiences for my players, for my coaches, because that's the only way really that they're going to buy into understanding what was right, what was wrong at that moment, and then obviously taking it forward as a learning outcome. And I don't know, I don't really have the massive depth of knowledge to understand all of that from a theoretical perspective, but I think just the opportunity to see people continue to be in love with the game as a part of having those experiences ultimately are the things I draw upon predominantly, and it works. I'm often very, very well. I'm ultimately very happy by seeing other people happy within the environment that I've helped create. So that's the feedback. That's all the feedback that I need. Be it working with professional football players all the way down to working with 4 or 5 year olds within a school. It's the same context, the same situation. It's just that, as I said earlier, it's your ability to see the detail as the coach within that context, and then apply the things to continue to keep it rolling. I don't know. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying, Owen, absolutely. And like this idea of the similarities between football and life, right? And it's good to teach in a way that's going to enhance these human qualities, right, rather than just maybe specifically what you might call football. Like, absolutely, but at the same time, I do see this difference, right, between football and life, because
of course
football is a game, right? It's a finite game.
Absolutely.
It has rules, structure, and it's zero sum, right? In its purest sense, is that one team wins, the other team loses. And it's quite interesting. This is what really, because I'm not saying I have an answer to these things. This is what interests me so much. Is that because I agree with your sort of analysis as well about capitalism, and we see things as resources, right? Things to be extracted, commodified, and I think that's very damaging, right? To be what it is to be human. Right? I think it's not a good idea. It's hyper materialism. But then in a non-zero sum game setting, which football is, and certainly perhaps it's more a context thing as well. I'm coaching at the moment for older players and there's some pressure to win, right? So winning is very important. So then it becomes, okay, well, how do I realize that I'm playing I'm playing a zero sum game, right, where it's win lose, and there are dynamics to that that I am responsible for in some sense, but also that's inside this larger thing that we've been talking about of this more human non-zero sum game. So you're almost having to play the two types of game at the same time.
Of course.
And then that is tricky, right? Because you don't want to turn out to be this dictatorial, this kind of radical authoritarian type who doesn't let anyone express themselves and doesn't leave any room for involvement. But at the same time, you're trying to run a tight ship, let's say, and be good at winning the zero-sum game. So it gets complicated, complex.
But it does, and I think I kind of tried to overcome that hurdle very simply, and it's to actually have no concentration on the result whatsoever. Apart from the results being ultimately a point of legacy, or a focal point of legacy in the longer term. So I know it's kind of weird, but the result, I can give you a really good example of this. So a year ago, I was 10 years ago. I'll go back 10 years. I was coaching a group of under 16s in a grassroots club whilst I was doing my degree, just as an opportunity for me to get some more coaching time and kind of take a position with a group age group that I've not really worked with before. So it was a lot of fun. Huge amount of potential within the group. The group had been underperforming for quite some time as well, if you looked at just the zero sum aspect of it. And I walked into the environment with an attitude that literally took the result out of the equation, and it put everything else, like I've been highlighting earlier, into it. And the results of it were they had the best season they had. They kind of came out with it with a semi-final place in which the club, or the group itself, had been kind of bottom of its league for years and years and years and years. But within the kind of the turnaround of one season. They'd managed to beat 2 or 3 of the top teams in that league, as well as then go to the semi-final, all based on the idea of a cohesive group, a kind of like a community of practice, if you want to call it that. And it fundamentally worked. But what that aside from the performance thing, the thing that really worked for me is that 10 years later, I got an invitation for a wedding through Facebook from a guy called Josh, who I'd not seen for 10 years because that was the only year that I had with that group. And inevitably, what happened is I kind of went from Sweden to England, went to his wedding thinking that I would just see him, and I actually saw the whole team. The whole team were there, and what had happened as a result of the work that had been put in by me and the group in that 1 year actually then continued to exist away from me for 10 straight years, where they actually stayed together as a team. They played together as a team. They were great friends as a result. And the whole wedding evening, the whole wedding reception was basically an absolute celebration of that 1 year, because there were a lot of players in that group who were coming up to me individually saying thank you very much for a wonderful time. And I see that as being the success as a result of that environment. And the winning or losing, I understand that in context. It's an incredibly important part of learning through life that you win or lose. But even failure as a context is a success because it gives you the opportunity as a facilitator to now engage that learning process even further. And that was the beauty of that group. We won, we lost, but we kind of worked on a set of values, and the success for me, the winning came from actually having that moment 10 years later as a result of all of the effort that got put in the first place. And I think that's not that I'm going to kind of discredit the idea of winning and losing. It's really important. But at the same time, I think if you're a coach who kind of tries to attempt to see the value from a almost a legacy perspective, what are you leaving behind? And I think there's that analogy of someone planting trees that they'd never sit under. That's what you should be seeing as a coach. And for me, that's kind of how I go out there. Now, Dave is absolutely right. That in its own emphasis is my opinion. So it is limiting to the point where I'm applying my set of values and maybe causing some form of dilemma in that instance. But I think if you extend that vision and view out to becoming much more of a humanistic focus on practice, you get wider outcomes. Mm-hmm. So that though there are limits, I think you do potentially get wider outcomes.
Here's where I think things start interesting. Is you've got this the holistic, the humanistic side, and you have all these values, and you have such a infinite range of outcomes because they're human outcomes, right? But the thing that's tricky is consensus, right? Because
absolutely,
something like that, we'd probably all agree that's a tremendous outcome, and you're there and you see it. But like at the end of the day, if somebody really pushes you on it and it's like, well, why do you say that's a good outcome? You have to just say, well, that's my values.
Yeah. It's a choice. It's a choice.
Yeah. And I don't think it's a problem with that. But then what's interesting is about the zero-sum part of the game is that the consensus is inherent to it. Like, that's part of it, is that like it gives you away. And I think that's when people start to get too far away from that, then there's something about the game that I think starts to come back towards the results part, because it's like that is always going to be a consensus part of the game because the results are the results. So it's kind of a weird relationship because, like you say, if you put those first, it generally doesn't go well by many different sets of values. But there's somehow like I feel like they're always in the picture because it's the only thing that ties everybody together. Because otherwise, you're just talking about, everyone's going to have their own sets of values.
Well, of course, if ultimately you've got to see the result of application in order for it to be evidenced, for it to show that it works. Mm-hmm. And I think again, I think I stated a little while ago that for me, the majority of time that I apply myself as a coach to a group going out and performing, there has been for a lot of the time good success as a result of seeing that holistic approach. It just takes a longer way around getting to that point rather than cutting corners. the problem with cutting corners is in terms of taking that straight line approach, is that you're now missing out on opportunities to engage that individual in taking just the game out of that equation. And I think that's, again, it's down to how accountable you are as a coach to what it is you want to see, and coming back to your philosophy and your values as an individual, what you want to apply. But for me, accountability to other human beings is an incredibly important part of what I do. So it's caring, I suppose.
I think it's interesting from a practical perspective, and we have people on the call who are working at different levels in football. But from my environment, where I'm dealing with parents on the sidelines, I'm dealing with building programs that are trying to develop culture. And I agree with you. I want to develop a culture for young people that is consistent with what you're saying, a person-centered approach. But then you also have to deal with parents who want this zero-sum game approach. And so, from a practical perspective, how do you deal with that? How do you, and maybe it's by grouping them by ability, but then you want to give them other experiences like how to develop empathy. So grouping them in co-ed situations might help them develop empathy. So it's a tough battle to try and play. And maybe it's just about forces and tension and trying to live in between those.
Exactly that. Again, as a mentor and work, predominantly working as a mentor, going into clubs, either with the FA in England or be it with NYFA here, you're always going to go first and foremost to the coach parent or the parents themselves and actually ask what do you want for your kids, what if you're digging deep to what it is you want to see from your children as they develop and grow, what do you want to see from them? And 9 times out of 10, you want them to, you hear the response. They just want to see a decent human being as a result of all of that effort. And then you obviously, you try and pick the specifics out of that, and ultimately you try and get there. But I think we know that, obviously, going back to that capitalistic or materialistic process that we find ourselves currently floating is that the ego reigns supreme. And the problem with the ego, again, is it in its own format limits potential due to circumstances. But it's but having said that, ego can be a fantastic tool to use in motivating a process. It's just that it depends on how the ego forms itself, and if it starts to have a negative impact on the circumstance, which for a parent, vicariously living through their child in order to see them win a game of football because they want to kind of see they want to be able to walk in to work on a Monday morning, say their 8-year-old won their game of football. Well, you've got to ask questions a little bit in and around this thing.
I think the ego is a super interesting way to look at this, because it's something we've talked about before as well, this idea of flow, right? And there's the book Csikszentmihalyi's book, idea of flow. And there's people like, there's been recently I read a book, Stealing Fire. I think maybe David's read. I'm not sure if everyone else has, but this idea, they really zoom in on this idea of collective group flow. And one of the hallmarks of that is this idea that the ego melts away, right? They use the language of dropping in to this collective idea, like a jazz band, right? Or something where you get into this collective. So I think this is a super interesting area, right, for coaches to be interested in right now. It seems to be happening right now.
I would agree.
But then the thing about that is that it's kind of paradoxical. Is that okay? Well, the reason, not the reason. One of the reasons I think that's a good thing for coaches to explore is because I think that a group that can operate in that level will be more effective. Effective at what? Winning.
Absolutely.
Right. So then it's like, okay, well, yes, I want to foster this collective harmony, right? This absolute communitas, this very, very strong bonding between perspectives, like a religion would do in society, that same sort of function, which, careful with these kinds of words, I know that they're quite loaded, a lot of them, but just generally from a technical level, like how they actually work, aligning of perspective, right, sharing of values, these kinds of things. And the reason I think that is good in this football context, I think it's good for everything. I think it's good for the people, and I think it's also good to win. So then it's like, okay, there's this aspect of trying to play these. I'm not saying I could do this, by the way, clearly, but just theoretically, right? But it's like it seems like a sensible way to maybe start thinking about this idea. So it's like we're not sacrificing winning. It's just that we think collective harmony is the best way to win.
Absolutely, and I think again, going back to the point of understanding. Well, I like to try and include the process of spirituality in most things that I do, because it's not a sense of direction via religion per se. It's much more again of an understanding of how I am able to apply myself within the dynamics of society in a way in which I can maintain a form and a premise towards others that's the best for them and the best for me, so that I kind of am able to do that. Now, if you're able as a coach to create a community or develop a community that kind of allows that to start to manifest and develop and even disseminate from a wider perspective, you are then able to really kind of get to the deep context of psychology and how you can end up apply certain theories in order to kind of get the things that you want, that ultimately in coaching and in football is the result. And that's kind of coming back to that whole holistic approach for the one thing. The whole notion of it though is that if you listen to Etienne Wenger talk about communities of practice, for example, and the practical applications of those kinds of ideologies, it's all about developing a culture, climate, and ethos that kind of mirrors what are the best parts of society, or what you want to see as the best parts of society, and envelop them into then seeing that being portrayed and performed out on the pitch.
Yeah, well, this is the All Blacks, right?
Sorry?
This is like the All Blacks, and they have articles written on transformational coaching and
exactly.
how that developmental climate actually produces this 100-year-long most successful team in history of sports.
And it's legacy. It's a legacy.
Then I start to wonder, and you'll know from your experience, but I wonder, like, how do you teach this, right? I mean, like to let's say coaches who are your group or your tutor groups. I've done my my licenses, and I sort of get how the whole thing works. But it's like, how I hear people talk about culture, but let's use here's a PowerPoint on the All Blacks and their culture, and it's like, yeah, cool, but like applying that, like understanding like the depth of knowledge, right, and depth of everything, like the depth of everything that allows these things to happen. Like,
so
that is
just
difficult,
real quick, just to tie things back together, I think this is a question maybe for the ecological people. Is it doesn't seem to me like this development of culture is exactly random, right? Like, I think, Jamie, you made the point last time that whether it be like a jazz band or SEAL Team 6 or a top football side, it's not like random groups of people are dropping in, to use that language, into these kind of collective harmonized flow states. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into it.
Individual work for the participants
as well, right? So then that's a question, I think, that comes back to that question of vision being kind of imposed by who, what values. And then also I think it comes back to communities of practice, like you said, maybe coaches understanding those communities of practice that they're working within. But I don't know, it doesn't to me like you get that just by kind of sitting back and everybody saying kumbaya.
No, but I think there's a balance between understanding the notion of something like spirituality and context in that, and then understanding the applications of it in current social context, and understanding that actually there's a lot of layers to peel back as a result of years and years and years of conditioning, both locally and globally. And I think that's where the tough part of, for example, us developing NYFA here in Sweden is that by developing NYFA, which is an organization predominantly led by its leaders, its young people, it's actually doing that in a country that has been so saturated with religion and politics, and very a very kind of like homogenous approach to population growth, that it's faced a few challenges in bringing something new, something kind of more, again, existential, something a little bit more spiritual to the context of sport, and then having it land. It's almost like an alien kind of coming out from outer space, landing on Sweden and trying to make it work. And I think that's the issues is ultimately we've kind of as a global society been processed and conditioned for quite some time now to understand that there is there are any certain rules or laws that apply that kind of allow you to be able to be successful or not. And I think, interestingly enough, I think that then rolls itself back into how you then open up the mind of those individuals that you work with in a way in which they can see the
It's
bigger
kind of
picture.
an unlearning.
Exactly, and it's divergent. The divergence or lateral thinking approach, I think, is where the key message or the key energy comes from when it comes to coaches then applying themselves on a practical level. So understanding what the reasons for why you want to encourage people to be divergent in thinking from a performance and from a more holistic perspective, and then ultimately seeing that as a precursor to creativity or attention, authenticity, application, and it's. I think you're right. It's still quite hard to kind of understand how it's not hard to understand, but it's a very, very tough question for a coach to try and deal with when it comes back to you finding the root point of the reasons for why you're applying all of this in the first place.
Yeah. What's my motivation, right?
Well, this is it, and I care. I think if I understand my motivation correctly, I care about other people. That's it. There's such a love for other people that ultimately it doesn't really matter how it goes. It's just I really like the idea of helping someone get to where they need to be, and that's my cause, and ultimately you'll then see the effect.
So is the problem that we're creating like a straw man of this ecological approach? So we're saying, okay, you just let things emerge and I sit back with my arms crossed. But maybe if we take a practical example like the All Blacks, I don't know much about that environment, obviously, but they have maybe very strict top-down, non-negotiable rules, which help constrain the environment in a certain way. And then from that emerges what they want to see emerge, but they let that emerge. But it's that there are specific top-down, non-negotiable rules, maybe.
Well, the mantra is no dickheads. So
that's a top-down rule.
It is a top-down rule. So it's a phenomenal rule, but that is the rule. No dickheads. Well, what does that mean?
So it's excluding a lot.
I love those kind of rules. That's that's like Google's ethics. Don't be evil.
But it's not totally open-ended, because if it was totally open-ended.
Yeah. So I'm going to let one of you guys speak. Go. I'll leave you alone for a little while.
David, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a lot. Just kind of processing. I think I really like what Jamie said the other day, the David Foster Wallace thing about, the old fish swims by the two young fish and he says, "Enjoy the water, boys." And the one looks at the other and he says, "What the hell is water?" And I think for me, that's a lot how I like to conceptualize these conversations for me, because it's like, I've been involved in the game my whole life. It's always been so close to me. It's such a constant, and it's, but I think I'm at that point where I'm like, what is this that I'm swimming in?
Yeah.
And that's for me where things get interesting, is starting with that curiosity. And I wish now that, looking back, that I would have been able to give some of my players or even teammates and a little bit of that curiosity of like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Because we all put a lot of time into it.
Oh, hell yeah. And again, going back to the whole point of the zero-sum element, is that who's going to remember a game of football being won 4 or 5 years ago? Who's going to remember you applying a certain approach to learning that made that individual be in a much better place for the longer term? It's that kind of trade-off of working out what's the best course of action and the best result of your action. But yeah, it's interesting enough. Your big picture soccer, which is your thing, David. When it comes to existential intelligence, for example, there's a big focus on the bigger picture, on the reasons for why we do what we do. I think that's kind of what I'm most curious about, and the one thing that I really enjoy challenging my players and my coaches with is the why. Why are you doing this? And what does it mean for you? Because going back to the whole point of engaging, so I really enjoy handing the keys of my tutoring over to the learners. So I remember delivering a level one for the English FA, and within the first 3 or 4 hours, they'd seen me dancing to Jamiroquai. They'd kind of saw me talk about Dweck, but they'd kind of throw it back on them a little bit. I then told them that they're all already experts in learning as a result of their life experiences and the things that they've been an active part of. And in a Gabor Mate kind of way, I tried to draw them back towards looking at their experiences as young people, as children, that ultimately led them towards either positive or negative experiences, and again put that into the perspective of them applying themselves as a coach, and creating that bubble of good feeling and empowerment. I think for me that there's a real opportunity for coaches and tutors to dig deep into that kind of approach, purely because you're handing the keys over and you're kind of bringing people who already have a lot of understanding, a lot of context in learning to the environment, to actually understand that they have the power to do that or to put it into place. It's just that I think a lot of coaches, unfortunately, getting so engrossed with the A, B's and C's of tactics and strategy within football, but they completely forget that there's this whole other raft of things that come along behind it that actually is the energy and the force. And I think your title of Big Picture Soccer is a really, really cool thing for me, because it actually ultimately indicates that there is a bigger picture to this. And
none of us, I don't think, are claiming to know what it is. We're just saying we're curious.
well, this is it. But that's exactly how it should be. We should be kind of, motivating and empowering people to be more curious about why they do what they do in the first place. And that's it.
I think, Bielsa, he's doing quite well just now, and he said, if football was played by robots, I'd never lose, right? And it's like, yeah, because the prop, no, it's not a problem. The coolest thing is, and maybe it's some of the coaches that get lost in the ABCs and the strategy and working out, which drill do I have to do tonight, and this kind of thing. It's like humans, right? This is a human endeavor. Right, it's like, and that football is not football unless it's being played by human beings, right? It is it is embodied, right? It's not you can think about it theoretically, but that's not football. Football is what happens with players playing the game, right? And it's like, okay, well then, there's no bigger mystery than humans, right? Like, we don't understand consciousnness. We don't get it. Like, some people say they have, we have models of this, and this is how this works. And it's like, well, yeah, okay. It's at best disputed, right?
Yeah.
It's at best disputed. I would say no one's got a bloody idea what's going on, right? So then you go, right, okay, well, we don't understand humans, and humans are the ones that play this game. So how can we understand it? So we're constantly on this journey of like trying to make some kind of sense out of this absolute crazy stuff.
But the beauty in Bielsa is that I think he determines his approach to other human beings in his environment to seeing just a few key simple things, which is space that's appropriate to the geography on the pitch. So the fact that you have white lines around the edge of that pitch means that there's only an amount of space that you can create as a result of being in possession or out of possession. How hard you want to actually, how hard you want to use that space or to deny that space. Ultimately, he obviously applies that to the degree in which he wants to see. He wants to see a high level of pressure and an ability to maintain a position of territory that gives his team the advantage of continuing to apply. And then beyond that, it's understanding as an individual the amount of space you require to have the time to make a good decision. And ultimately beyond that, how the individual then takes the process of either looking for a better option to play to, ideally forward, or as themselves to be able to break lines and hit spaces and cause absolute chaos. And there's no coincidence that Guardiola back in 2010 was spending a lot of time with Bielsa.
Absolutely.
If you look at the way that Barcelona are playing at the time, I think Bielsa ultimately throws those concepts in a way in which everybody understands it, and then goes, great, off you go, have fun. And then it's then down to the interpretation and the application of that from his players.
Yeah, and then but this is what's so cool, because you get Bielsa doing that, and then you'll get Red Bull doing their version, right, which is different. Yep. Right, it's different. Definitely, football is different. It's less of this kind of sort of Bielcista sort of Latin school. It seems more like German engineering, right? It's like breakneck speed, like the tempo of those teams that are playing now is like what I've never seen anything like it.
Like the Autobahn, yeah.
Right. No, and it makes sense. It comes from Germany, right? Okay, or this part of the world, because it's like hyper engineered, and it's like, okay, cool. This looks great, but it's not the only way of doing it. Then it's like, okay. No. Well, then Bielsa's got this individuality, and you mentioned authenticity, right? I think there's few more authentic characters than Bielsa.
Completely agree.
And that's that authenticity. But then authenticity would be something like the willing to do things differently, right? To do it your way. But then you just have to say, well, that's different from this homogenized idea of like, I'm just going to let the game decide. I'm going to do it my way, which is kind of at odds with that, although it can include many of the same principles. But so it's just, I think it's just cool. Just like when different people do it. You know?
I wonder how would you be able to apply something within a culture that would be opposite to that culture? So could you play like a slow possession game in Germany if you're a German? Would that be a divergent way of thinking about it? Would that even work?
I don't want to stereotype too much, but but I know what you mean. Yeah. There definitely styles emerge in different places. Yeah, that's for sure.
This is the massive issue that the German FA currently have in remapping their educational curriculum, is that for a long time there's been success as a result of that formulaic approach, but now they're starting to realise that not only from an international performance level, but actually from a player transfer level, the business side of football, Germany is no longer producing the kinds of players that are being able to be kind of compete with the same figures that other players are being sold in the rest of the world, and I think that's something that the Germans have obviously kind of started to recognise. In fact, the English FA recognised it 15 years ago when they kind of they once again looked at their watching. Oh, look, another World Cup's gone by. We've been knocked out of the quarterfinals again. You know, we're not producing players that can kind of compete with the likes of Spain. How do we do that? And luckily enough, I've worked for the organisation to a degree in which they've recognised that from the bottom up, things need to be better. And that's the bottom up, meaning the grassroots needs to be much better in order to filter through into the academy and the elite routes. And the German model has to change as a result, and it is. So I think there's obviously massive focus on making that difference. But again, I think what you have is if you can apply an environment that encourages divergency in a way in which it's processed in group but encouraged to individuals, you have much more of a canvas to work with as when it comes to that individual player or that group, or as if you were just kind of linear in your approach, if you were just kind of limited in terms of thinking just one strategic action as being the only way. I think Guardiola's actually come unstuck as a result of that of recent times, if I'm being honest. Even Klopp lost yesterday 3-0 to Watford. Yeah, I think all situations get found out if you don't consistently adapt.
So I think, would you agree with the statement then that no one's successful, people are only successful in context? Meaning, you haven't solved the game. You've solved the game as it's played in the place, the culture, the time that you are interacting with it.
Well, yeah, because I think if you looked at Guardiola 10 years ago to what it looks like now for Guardiola, it's a different situation. But though he had a different group of players, the dynamics were just that much more different. The league that he was competing in at the time was way different too in terms of its context. So it's he's got, obviously the guy's going to have a lot of success. He's got a lot of money behind him in order to buy those players necessary. But at the same time, philosophy reigns supreme, and if your philosophy can't consistently be adapted to suit, you're not going to stay in it for long. And I think Alex Ferguson is probably the best coach/manager who has been able to show continuous adaptation and continuous success as a result. Though I don't know if you guys agree with me on that. I'm not. It's.
Yeah, I think Ferguson definitely was able to. He seemed to surround himself with very smart coaches. Carlos Queiroz was that example where he sort of ripped up his playbook and sort of embraced the modern game, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
But yeah, David, I've been thinking this idea of like being successful in a context, right? And it's almost even people talk about intelligence, right? And they have like IQ tests and these kind of ways of it. And I don't really, I think that's not my cup of tea, right? And I'm like, well, if there is some sort of what makes a smart person, maybe it's understanding what you are and understanding a context that you're going to be in good relation with.
Right.
And what doesn't, it could be anything. It really doesn't matter what it is. But it's like, and you can say, well, what's good relation? I don't know, sort of general feeling of well-being and health and enjoyment and that kind of thing. But if you're able to find, and that could be the same for a coach, what kind of coach are you? Where's going to be good for me to coach? Like, or just a person in general, right? Like, what kind of person am I, and what kind of context am I going to find that good relation in? Sort of strikes me as sort of a smart person, someone who gets that right. Okay.
That's interesting to me. If you take like something like Nietzsche, so know thyself, and then I remember reading about Goethe, and he would say like figure out what you're good at and hypertrophy those aspects. And maybe from a practical perspective, then if you're coaching youth players or even adult players, should we play them in multiple positions to have them well-rounded, or should we find what their qualities are and hypertrophy those qualities? And so that's
early specialization. Now here we go.
I don't know, not necessarily doing that.
I'm just going to go to the toilet. Just bear with me. I'm not joking. Cool. Interesting conversation. Can I listen? You guys go now. Cool. So, what do you think? Should we be focusing on early specialization as an opportunity to push?
What is early specialization? People say it like, what is it? Also, just putting kids in what groups?
Pigeonholing young children into position relative to I suppose exactly, and physicality, I suppose as well, the capacity.
I think probably yes and no. I mean, I don't know. I'm no expert on this, but sure, like probably yes and no. I don't know. Like there's obviously going to be drawbacks, but at the same time, like if kids are gifted, like is that a thing? Is that terminology one would use? I don't know, but surely, I mean, it seems obvious that there are players that are pretty good with the football when they're young, and put them all together. And maybe they're going to be in that elite. I don't want to use that word because it's loaded, right? But that
massively.
And that environment that where they're able to, maybe if you put all those ball players in a group together, what emerges would be something that wouldn't emerge if you put them in amongst, if you mixed it, let's say. Or maybe you do both. Like I don't really know, but I do think that if you had like 10 Ronaldinhos, right, playing, the thing that emerges between them when they're 7, 8 years old is probably different to if you mix the abilities, let's say.
Yeah.
Well, and from a philosophical perspective, what is it about the human being that is fixed, and what is it about them that can change? And I don't know where I stand on that exactly.
Yeah. Well, again, I suppose it comes back down to growth, the growth mindset approach to life, and where that comes from the connection to playfulness and being a child. Ultimately, we seem to, there's this wonderful situation where we give birth. A woman will effectively give birth to an expert learner, because that individual within moments is already embracing the environment to the degree in which she is able to survive as a result. That means that adaptation is occurring straight from the outset, and is then being applied in a very organic way. That then obviously as the kid continues to grow without the understanding of learning or understanding of, so I can really go with I've got 2 boys, so Finley is 5 and Leo is 2. We've been living in Sweden for 3 years. Both of them were Finley in particular, the 5-year-old was fluent in Swedish within a year. His understanding and perception of language is that what is language? What is language? There's no real context to him or a box that kind of says language on the side of it to him. It's just something that he got put in and something that he had to adapt to. And that's the thing. When we come to looking at the way that we engage children for a process, it's got to always be going back to the root cause of them applying themselves within the world, and that's to make this growth aspect of learning as applicable as possible all of the time, even when we're as adults, to be able to apply that notion. So
here's something that jumps out to me. So when we're speaking about children, let's say under 13, 14, so younger children, and there's a lot of pushback against early specialization, I think rightfully so, but I think people get caught up a lot in terms of the level of the game, the playing ability. But I think it's an interesting question about what is that game to that child, and
Mm.
that's never going to be the same because every life is unique. And if you read Ronaldinho's story, his father passed away, and the only thing he had left was a picture of him and his father and with a ball, right? So you can imagine like his relationship to the game is going to be different from somebody who, well, my friends play football, so every once in a while I'll get on the park. And I think, you can look at it in terms of, oh, should we group kids in terms of ability? And I think there are a lot of ethical questions, but I think also kids lose something if they don't get the experience of being with other kids who have a similar enthusiasm for the game, let's say.
Mm.
Because that's what I've noticed, coaching young kids. It's like the game doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. Like, let's not get caught up in these deterministic, oh, this kid's gonna be a professional, or whatever. But it's just the fact that different kids engage with the game differently. For some of them, it's like whatever. Maybe I'll play, maybe I won't. For other ones that very into it, and I know for myself as a kid, I wanted to play with kids who loved the game as well.
Mm.
So I mean, maybe that's a little bit of a different view than just looking at it in terms of ability.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it has to be part of the conversation when we think about early specialization.
Of course, especially in context of relating to the game and the reasons for why they're there in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back to the playful nature of children, then ultimately they define their learning through play. So if there are a lot of good, positive experiences that come from playing and its connection to learning and getting better, be it failure or success, it's ultimately going to kind of manifest as a 13, 14-year-old who will continue to be in love with the game or wants to continue to be in love with the game. It's those horrible traumatic experiences that come from having that negative experiences attached to a learning moment that really will turn a child off. And that's where the coach really has to be aware of their position as a mediator for learning. I think that the beauty in having that connection between children of a similar mindset is that there is a sense of belonging to something that actually now is tangible, and again, you're looking at the meaning of life, or in fact the reasons for why you feel good about doing something. Well, it's always nice to find someone else who has that same motivations, that same connection. What we do with kids is, I think, sadly, through an education system, is we take away the process of divergency very early on through formalized education, and that divergency effectively, obviously, is the background of creativity. Because creativity is taken away, it actually strips a part of the playfulness of life back, and children lose as a result. And I think, again, when it comes back to us applying ourselves as coaches within sport is about play. It's about playing, and ultimately, I think we need to make sure that we maintain that premise as much as we possibly can. Even at 40 years of age, I love playing. Even if it's just running around in the garden with my kids playing 1v1, it's just to play. And that's sorry.
But and I think the play is good. I love to play. But the thing about play is that if I'm playing Monopoly with 3 other people that don't care about, like, we could still all be playing, but if they're not taking it as seriously, maybe as I am, everyone's got their, like, I think I agree with what David said. I like that. I think it's really cool. It's like the enjoyment seems to come to some extent or a large extent from playing with people who who are taking it almost as seriously as you are. It's like, and maybe that's different for kids. I haven't worked a huge amount coaching kids, but just from thinking back to my own, like, what I like to do is, like, you want to play with someone like who's at the similar level, right? It kind of, that enhances the enjoyment and makes the play almost like, it's almost more these things that emerge, because the plays you're learning through play, right? But you can learn, it's almost accelerated, right?
It's the competition aspect of it. Then it's the ability to compete.
Absolutely, and I like competition, and it's like, I think and most, if not all, footballers that I've coached love competition. It's like, even in little exercises, drills, warms up, I make it oftentimes competitive. Keep score. That's why we keep score, right? Because if I'm vocal about keeping score, people seem to, there's definitely an extra intensity that seems to arise, but just from what I've noticed. So I don't think competition's a bad thing at all, right? I think competition's great. I think it's really fun. It's really engaging. It's good.
Absolutely.
And it's good, and it's cool. So yeah, I think the competitiveness is something that you would, if you're going to not, I don't know how it's done, but if it's new, you're not going to group people together on these ability, whatever it is, then you might lose. Well, I guess you lose.
Well, I think like,
but sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Alex.
I think it's really interesting because Canada Soccer is revamping their coach education, and they're trying to develop a different kind of culture. And one of them is based on what Mark says about keeping kids in for as long as possible in the best environment as possible, et cetera, et cetera. And one experience I had this past week, I coached a 2008 team of high-performing boys, and they're quite talented. Maybe talent isn't the right word to use. And we played a co-ed game against girls. And one of the boys on the team, he's got a difficult home life, and he's a little bit of he can be quite mean to other players. And so this is something we've been working on throughout the year. Well, in this game against the girls, he was saying things to me like, Coach, I'm not going to use phrases like, oh, you throw like a girl, because I don't want to be mean to them. And that's something I'd never heard from this kid. So now this experience is that he's learning about empathy. He's learning about how to deal with other people. And maybe in terms of, you go back, Owen, to what it is, the reason why you're coaching. That's a beautiful moment, obviously.
Absolutely. Right? So, that's one that will last forever as a result. Yeah, because you're now changing effectively the direction of intention that individual has on the world. He's now perceiving the world in a completely different way, and that's in a much more positive and much more empathetic and empowering way. So that's pretty cool. Interesting. I'll go back to the point. Sorry, go back to the point of competition.
Yeah.
Does ego come somewhere in line with competition?
Yeah. I don't know. This is super interesting because it's like, I don't know. Maybe I have no idea. Maybe it is the something to do with. I don't know what that is, but there's definitely. I'm from my perspective, I like a certain level of competition is the word. Is to compete, to test myself. Like where am I? And maybe it is some an ego thing, and maybe that's not all bad. Maybe it is all. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I think that testing is okay. Well, I didn't make that. Shit, I need to improve. I need to make myself better so that then I can hit that challenge. Shit.
Yeah.
Repeat.
Yeah. That's cool.
This is somewhat anecdotal, but I think people talk a lot about adults imposing adult values onto child's play, right? And I think that's a very good thing to wonder about and to kind of inquire into and investigate. But I think sometimes that the shame associated with losing, is an adult imposition. Because I think kids can compete quite intensely. I don't know. I mean, it could be in some situations if some kids are maybe bullies or whatever. But I've seen kids compete quite intensely, and I don't see them have this idea that if somebody beats you, me and Jamie playing 1v1 backyard, and he's just better than me, and he just, beats the hell out of me, and I can't stay with him. I don't see kids see that as like this awful, like hierarchical domination and oppression. Like, I think that sometimes is an adult imposition. I think kids are just like,
massively
whatever, he's better than me. And I think, you'll hear sometimes people say, don't play games that have elimination with young kids, right? I think that's probably a pretty good general rule. But I remember, anytime you got the chance to play knockout, some people call it King of the Ring, right? The game where you're in a space and whoever is the last person with the ball. What I notice is, like, even with young kids, at the point when most of them are out, they're on the edge and they're cheering for whoever's in, right? And they're into it and they're really excited. They're not here like, oh, I've been oppressed by this hierarchical adult model of competition. So it's context, right?
Oh, this is it. And failure is an adult word. Yeah,
exactly.
Ultimately, interestingly, again, going back to Dweck, Dweck highlights that in her research, children didn't actually understand what failure was until they were told what it was by the adult. Ultimately, it kind of came down to the crux of it being something that was now imposed as a negative response to that moment rather than a positive one. I think Dweck's fantastic at articulating that, because growth mindset disappears the moment a child understands that failure is now a bad moment rather than a learning moment. And that's the problem. Kids don't understand how to what losing means in terms of failure. They just understand it as a moment to learn. And that's crucial for how we again apply ourselves within the field of coaching.
So is there something? Yeah, is there something to teach adults a bit more about that? Well, I guess that's why Taleb's book Anti-Fragile is so popular, right? Because it's basically what he says. He's like, look, yeah, exactly that. When things don't happen, when you're stressed, when disorder happens, when systems fail, that's when you strengthen, right? That's how it works. And it's like people like that idea, but yeah, like you say, and people seem to just have this idea of failure, negative, oh dear, oh it's all bad, and growth mindsets. This term is probably again got critique back, but yeah, it's like it's very important, right? This failure is this opportunity to learn, and if the kids think that, then great. And I think there is a danger, David, of adults imposing their own view of failure as negativity, and I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, the problem with highlighting failure is that ultimately the adult in that situation is recognised as a negative, and ultimately is now imposing their egoic view of that circumstance as the result of having to move forward, which again really takes a lot of opportunities out of the equation from a learning perspective, especially if now some of those learning moments are to a very detrimental level, be it psychological, it's now having a bad impact on an individual, and as a consequence, will have a knock-on effect on every other moment they have as a result. Again, you've got to, for me, and this is not conspiracy theory to any degree. Well, it is, I suppose, if you want to see it. But I honestly believe that we are being, over the course of time, being much more socially engineered to create those kinds of scenarios in order to weaken the psychological state of individuals and groups. Because to do that puts people into a compromised position in which it's much easier to manipulate. And if you're a coach now who's consistently dominating a group through negative talk, it's much easier to now get your points across, especially if you have really no other higher understanding of an ideal, or if you have an agenda that's actually not associated to the primary audience at focus, which again comes back to that care point and that egoic point. As a coach now operating with an ego, what is this environment for? Is it for you or for them? And that's the question I often ask the coaches I mentor almost very, very quickly. Why are you doing this? Is it for you or is it for them?
Can it be both? Can it be both?
It should be. Yeah, it can be both. And the beauty in mentoring is that actually if you're consistently putting on creating a positive situation in which that coach learner is walking into a process of learning and empowerment, you can actually not only engage learning through the children, but you can see the coach really develop themselves, which for an adult is an exceptionally profound moment in time. You can really, really see people take big steps as an adult to recognize that there's more to it. But,
and I get joy out of like what you're saying. I get joy out of having those conversations 5 and 10 years later. So there is some egoic part of it, and I agree with you, Jamie. It should be both. I think that they get the joy because I'm not imposing these adult notions about failure, et cetera, but I also get it too. So, and I want it. I enjoy that. That's why I do what I do. So yeah, I think it's important that it is both in that sense. But if it's both in the sense that you're like, okay, I want to win, and then, if I win the U13 Cup, I'm going to be a top coach or whatever, then that might be problematic. But
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's probably good for anybody who works with kids to really investigate why. I do think sometimes with the way things are right now, it's almost like coaches are guilty until proven innocent. Maybe sometimes where I don't know if that's a healthy direction to go. I think it's probably people are maybe making those assumptions probably for a reason, right? A lot of people have had personal experience of somebody who worked with kids, and whether it was something that they missed in childhood, or there's also probably questions to ask as an adult. The fact that children don't see your position in society the same way as adults do. So maybe I think that's a good question for adults who work with children to ask, like, oh, am I getting something out of the fact that these kids don't see my status? And what insecurities do I have around that? So there's probably a lot of good questions to ask, right? I think
Absolutely.
I don't know. I think either way, if people say, "Oh, this person works with kids, they must be a beautiful soul and perfect intentions," that's obviously not true. I think it's also wrong to be inherently suspicious of everybody.
Mm.
So, yeah, I don't know, somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Well, look, the beauty in the adult platform is that we still have things to learn.
Mhm.
So you can very very quickly, as long as you're capable of de-arming the situation in a way in which you kind of walk into a classroom as a tutor or as someone who's walking on the pitch as a mentor. As long as you can go in and kind of have some level of emotional intelligence
Mhm.
to engage that individual, kind of recognize the signs, and kind of make some kind of objective judgment, and then you're generally going to be able to get a relatively decent reaction from an adult that you go and engage. But it's
Mhm.
yeah,
I think it's all just. I just like the mystery of it all. To be
yeah,
and I'm always I always get a little bit. Well, yeah, I don't particularly like it when like it bother me that much, but I get suspicious of when people think they have this. Okay, here's how it is. This
Mhm.
is what we do, and you're like, well,
yeah.
I think I don't see why if you take all the landscape of, let's say, ideas towards, maybe not all, but like, there's lots of different seemingly contradictory ideas. I don't see why a lot of the time they can't just go together. It's like, why can't we have a bit of this and a bit of that, a little bit of this here and a bit of that there, and we can sort of all mix it up a little bit. It's just, yeah, it's the one way stuff that I always get a
Mm.
little bit
Completely
unsure of.
agree.
Yeah, yeah.
Completely agree. And I think that's the beauty of coaching is ultimately, I often say this to groups, is that when I operate as a coach, I'm attempting to try and make myself obsolete within the framework. There's no need for me to be there. If I can actually identify that as being the case in the first place, I won't be there. There's no
Mhm.
point.
Mhm.
I watch my 2 and my 5-year-old, for example, again, good examples of my direct experiences. Those guys 9 times out of 10 don't need me to play. It's great for them to have some form of connection with me playing, because it kind of gives them a completely different perspective, a different aspect, especially from a physical point of view. Which I think there's a lot. There's some research out there that suggests that children do need some level of physical interaction with adults at an appropriate level in order
Yeah.
for them to grow and develop.
Yeah.
But and that's the beauty about being a parent, is you can kind of have that connection with your kids. Maybe it's not so good if you're working with your group out on the field, but ultimately I watch my 2, and they interact with each other, they interact with their environment, they interact with the materials that they use, and generally 9 times out of 10 there's no need for an adult to be a part of that experience. It's just, for example, I might put the big Lego bag that we have, in a certain point in the room just to test if they'll go to that space first and go and play the Lego. Or I might move the Paw Patrol truck just in that corner over there to see how it engages them at that point. So, and that comes back to TGFU, and it comes back to Marco Sullivan's stuff, is that if you create task constraint within training as a result, and it's game in game and game related, you can get your outcomes out that way. You don't necessarily need the coach as a result. So that's yeah. Anyway,
I
enough
think
of that.
what's
Go on.
interesting for me though is like you have that, but then the other side of that coin is that like when you're working with kids, I'm sure you guys have all had experience, especially with young children, where you have this moment where you realize that like they really admire you. And
Mm,
I think it can be a bit frightening sometimes because then you wonder like, well, who am I? I've got so many shortcomings and whatnot. But I think that is part of the equation as well, is that like kids do look at adults. That's part of the beauty of working with kids, is that they know, in some sense, a lot of times they know what they don't know, and they can sense when there's people who are there pouring into them, and
mm,
people who do that in a genuine manner. I think they do admire, like,
yeah.
just from interactions that I've had with players, that sometimes you may not even realize it. Sometimes it's the players who give you the hardest time, but then after you're like, oh, you hear low notes from parents, or they'll write you a card or something, and you realize like, oh, you know, there was some interaction there that transcended just the game.
Yeah, and I think. Sorry, on you go.
No, you go first. No, Jamie, you go.
Yeah, I was just gonna quickly touch on. I don't want to get, we're getting on, but like, I don't want to get too technical. But you mentioned Mark and the game, designing the game constraints, right, to get the behaviors without necessarily, having to do that much if your game design is smart. And like, absolutely, like, the game design is a super important part of coaching, I think. Absolutely, and I love game design. Like, I want a transition game. I want to condition this behavior. I want to condition forward passes. Then I'm not just going to stand there and shout, pass forward. Yeah, design the game so that they're rewarded for the action that you want them to. Yeah, like, absolutely. But at the same time, like, that's cool, and parts of my sessions are that. But then parts of it are completely different. I don't do any of that. And I'll be like, okay, I just want you to become better. I want you to play with the ball. I want you to juggle with the ball. I want you to use different parts of your body, all the surfaces of your foot. I want you to do all different things. And I don't even see a tension between those two approaches. I think they're complementary, in fact. And one quick one as well. When you do the games, sometimes I had a player come in and join the group, and his technical level wasn't as high as perhaps the other one, but we thought he was a useful player, good player, and we wanted to develop him. But in the early games, small-sided games, he would not be involved as much and made a couple of mistakes. His game was cut tempo, and you could see his head drop a little bit, and it was tricky for him in there. So I thought then that sort of the more individual sessions based with just him and the ball were really valuable in getting him just as a human, as a person, to feel good about then having that confidence with the ball to go back into those game environments and say, okay, right now I'm with the group now. And so they're definitely not. Sometimes I get the idea, and this is maybe me getting it wrong, that there's this idea that this kind of individual stuff with the cones and the ball is really bad, and it should all be game designed. And it's like, I just think, why not both? Why not use everything?
I do both, and I love the connection to the individual and the ball. But that comes through. I use three words: confidence, which you said, competence, and then autonomy. And if on a psychological level, the individual, like you've explained, if they're capable of now connecting the dots between their competence and confidence on an individual level into then the game, then ultimately what you'll start to see is gradual transfer and a much more heightened sense of connection to the game as they grow. Yeah. And I think if you think about Ronaldinho in that context, he must have had loads of those moments. Loads of those moments in which failure on a technical level was the thing that kind of inspired him to become much more divergent in his thinking. And that's Ronaldinho would not have got that good without individual practice.
Yeah, this is the thing, and I just think this is so obvious. I just want to scream it. I'm like, those guys were just like juggling the ball to school. Like, this is like,
every day, all day.
Yeah, and it's like,
I think it does need to be said, because like anybody who's played knows, like, you did play a lot on your own. You did kick the ball against the wall. You did just shoot in a goal.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I don't think those are bad things. I mean, maybe if you're paid to coach kids and you use all the time doing that, I think
the argument you get is efficiency. People say efficiency is that kids can do that at home. If you're into running the session, then maybe it's more efficient, right, to do this kind of games thing, and the kids can do that at home. But I don't know. Sometimes I think it's like, you can vary it, mix it up,
Oh yeah, well I think it's context.
Yeah.
I think, interestingly enough, I've coached one-to-one sessions for a long time and done a lot of individual work. And again, I kind of appropriately measure my one-to-ones not only on a coaching level but a mentor level as well. So opportunities to actually spend time with the player, kind of get deep into it.
This is a big part of it, huge part.
Massively so, and I think the beauty is context. If you design practices even at a one-to-one level that look like the game, you're going to get what you want. But the beauty in working with the individuals, you can really, really get deep into the individual context and understanding of the game. As long as you paint the picture. If it's now a kid, you're working on an individual basis and you're getting them to dribble through a line of cones repeatedly, that's not contextual. That doesn't look like context. There's always decision making at the heart of everything that the player does. So ultimately, your individual session has to look like it's something that creates decisions.
Is there though something about a kid who's going through the cones, using different parts of the foot, etc., just feeling good with the ball? Like that is the context. I mean, I understand the decision element of this. Like, I understand what you're saying, but sometimes I think, well, yeah, okay, that's totally fine. But at the same time, there is something just between the human and the ball that is kind of, it's weird. It's kind of mystical. It's kind of strange, and it's like your ability to be a ball handler, to use different parts of your body, and like doing little tricks, rainbow flick it and head it 10 times in the air and catch it on the back of your arm. Like, can you do that? It's not. I don't want you to do it in a game, but I tell you what, you feel good if you can do it, and you feel good with the ball, and you feel like, yes, I'm getting this. You know, and I understand it's not part of the game per se, but a human being with a ball to me is part of the game. So.
You're reacting to context again. That's the simple part. I think again the dynamics of the game are so vast that ultimately you just got to try and paint as big a picture as possible in that situation. But I a kid, I lived half a mile away from my school and I walked it every day. But I started playing football in around 10, and I dribbled the ball to school every day, and it was wind, rain, snow, sun. You know, there were some roads I had to cross. Depending on the traffic, I had to kind of deal with the ball in a different way. I'd hit a sign, a road sign as a target, and if I hit it, I got 5 points. You know, there were just certain things that I did as a result of my work, my work every day. It's not on the football pitch, but it's potentially contextual because it has targets and it has challenges.
Right.
I agree. So it's. I think that the whole premise of one-to-ones, again, get it as real and as close to the game, and you've got some opportunities for learning. And the more you can give, the better it gets. It's not rocket science, though. It isn't rocket science, which I think a lot of coaches tend to kind of paint a picture. They paint a picture in which it is rocket science, and that it is this and this and this. Now, Ronaldinho was playing on the streets. You know, the dynamics that surrounded him was so fluid in concept that, you know, ultimately the only things that really kind of propelled him forward were the game's overriding principles and what he could do physically with football. Simple as that. So, yeah. Love him as a player, by the way. He's my favourite.
Right.
Really. I'm just going to switch a light on, by the way. That's all right. There we go. Hey.
Yeah. Well, that's nice. That's nice. Yeah, that's nice. I mean, I think, I agree. Like, I think it's nice to be able to do these different things together, and I think that's a cool way of doing it for sure. I just wonder, then you get into the question of, right, shit, how do you teach? Like, is this something that should be a broader message of like, look, everyone, there's lots of different ways to coach, and there's lots of different aspects to it, and it's not a case of just doing this type of thing. Like, it really does depend. But then it's like, well, it's really difficult to say as a message because we keep saying, you know, depends on the context, depends on this, that, and the other thing. People are going to go, well, what am I supposed to do here? And that's but then I think it's just experience. Like, you have to go and do it.
Exactly.
Like,
so then mentorship.
Yes, I think something like that, like apprenticeship. Yeah, apprenticeship would be great.
Well, let's say you walk by the park and you see a guy doing a 1v1 session with a kid, 12 years old, who cares? And the kid's just dribbling through cones. You're not wrong to say, like, well, if you look at the skill act, it doesn't transfer, there's no decisions, right? But then what if you step back and someone's like, yeah, that kid's dad just died 2 months ago, and that's a friend of the family who's just out there spending time with the kid. All of a sudden, you're like, oh, it's a different thing, right? It's a different context.
Sure. Exactly.
A lot of kids a lot of kids love kicking the ball against the wall. It's soothing. It's rhythmic. It's like a game. You get better at it. You do it. Who cares if it transfers? It's the context of it for a lot of kids makes it, I think, a useful activity.
Yeah. The human transfers, right?
Yes.
The kid transfers because they themselves going to go and play the game. So like that feeling they get of enjoyment, of just enjoyment, that's good for transfer because then they're going to go and play the game feeling good, right? I think that's super important.
Has anybody read Bergkamp's book?
Stillness and Speed, yeah. It's
a good book. He talks a little bit in and around his childhood and his relationship to the ball, and the fact that his house was an end terrace, so he was lucky enough to have the wall and the bricks were kind of marked as one to whatever, and he would systematically just try and strike in different ways on one touch. So it was repetition without repetition as a result of the circumstance. So even if you're looking at how a child just applies the context of kicking the ball at a wall, it's always going to be slightly different from one moment to the next, and that's that repetition element without repetition, which is a key message when it comes to things like non-linear pedagogy, the whole emphasis of constraints-based learning, as you are creating an opportunity to repeat without the necessary repetition or close skill repetition. So it's I suppose if I looked at my one-to-ones and the experiences of them, if I've got a kid that's smiling and happy, is walking away feeling incredibly good about their time spent with me as a result of the interaction, then for me on a human level, it's phenomenal, and that's way more important than the football winning aspect. But if we can get the best of both, that's even better. And that's,
totally.
That's
but then the problem is people say, "Well, what, anything goes? Like, just do anything." I'm almost of the position where I go,
exactly.
If you're seeing good results, right? I don't mean the numbers necessarily, but if you're seeing development in the way that you want the person or the team or whatever, or you're to develop, then within ethical, being reasonable, like obviously, but in terms of like what your practice looks like
exactly.
I don't see a problem, right,
No, absolutely not. And again, I think that's the problem with over-engineering training sessions on a technical level, is that you can literally coach that good feeling that comes from having that anything goes approach out, and then you're starting to lose the interest of those individuals actually that you're supposed to be focusing on. How many times I've been involved in sessions myself as a player where the coach just bores the shit out of me because he's once again stepping in after 30 seconds of telling us before about the way that we have to strike a ball, and we have to look at it like this way, and you're like, well, hang on, I could have taken a better turn with the outside of my foot rather than having the receiver back foot whilst on the half turn. Would have been just a much better. But no, because of the rigidity of his thinking, I'm done as a player, because you've got to have that situation where you go, okay, well, from a unique standpoint, this individual is going through a completely different set of situations than I am, even at this moment, and that's.
And there's that idea of like the say you're receiving it on the turn, something example like that, like you'd say something like the physicality of the individual plus the environment affords the kind of maneuver that's going to happen, right? But then you can say, well, how about during my individual sessions, what I'm doing is trying to broaden the scope of their affordances, right? So that
guide their attention.
And maybe because they feel comfortable taking it with the outside of their left foot, before they never used the outside of their left foot, but now that's opened up this other doorway, this other way of doing it. Which is why one of the ways they could go hand in hand,
Well, here's a nightmare scenario for any player playing when Ronaldinho was at his pomp. In respect to him being up against you on a one-to-one basis now, how the hell are you going to deal with him? You just don't know what's coming. You don't know what's coming. He's got multiple affordances. As you highlight, he's got multiple decisions that he can literally just switch out whenever he wants. You're screwed now.
And it's like, it's not as if
research. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, what I loved about Ronaldinho that I think people always could see is, like, it's not as if you were like, is he going to go left or right? It's like you were like, oh, he may go left or he may go right. And then he's like in another dimension. He's like going up and down, and like he would do things that weren't in people's conceptual framework to even consider as possibilities of the game.
Yeah, but if you now take, sorry, go on. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, with Keith David's research about how parkour might be a donor sport in the sense of 1v1. So now your affordances are really opened up, because you can go to the extreme limits of your movement, because in parkour you have to be able to bail immediately, right?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. See, for me, it comes back down to that process of lateral thinking or divergent thinking. If you take that out, you don't get Ronaldinhos. And if you can produce more Ronaldinhos, defenders have no opportunity to defend. And that's what you want out of the game. The invasion game element is to invade, not to defend. Yes, defending is a part of it, but ultimately you've got to score goals. More Ronaldinhos mean more divergent thinking, which means that you, as an opposition, now have no idea how to strategize or to develop a set of tactics to deal with it. That's what you want.
then you get like, how do you create like this idea that you produce Ronaldinho is almost then you're like, fuck, like then it's like, do you produce Picasso, right? It's
Yeah,
not
exactly.
really like you can't just like start an art school and get everyone to paint like Picasso, right? It's like, yeah, there's got to be some. There's obviously some things that we can help, but like there's also like we have to. These players come from, and same thing sometimes with coaches as well. Like they just come from another. They're just doing it different, and it's like okay. Yeah, I just think it's super interesting of how you, how we try to think about what is actually happening in terms of how much are we, like what's happening with this game, right? Because there's these things coming at it from all different perspectives, all different views of doing things, and the game kind of integrates all these things into itself. And then it's like this fluid, this is something you talked about, David, this fluid moving thing all the time. And it's like, even to understand it is like very, very tricky, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued to kind of to get into Ronaldinho's head, and even if you kind of went back in time or in his head for the next 20 years, how many times he enters flow state, or as a result of him performing. In fact, I can guarantee that guy every time he went on the pitch as a professional, he's already in flow, and that for me is very much an indicator of a more internal connection with the game, where it's again much more of a spiritual process. It's much more of how we connect on in terms of our value with the ball and what it means at that point. And to be honest, if you now really go into spirituality with someone like Eckhart Tolle, living in the present, that moment in which he's just nutmegged the player is a moment in the present. There's nothing else that surrounds that situation, past or in the future. It's just a moment of presence. Now, ultimately, past will have an influence on the basis of how that defender interacts with that individual. But because he doesn't know what's coming, the future is undecided, and that's where spirituality of football overall. Because I think if you look at Ronaldinho, he has probably Jinga as a cultural, spiritual connection to football is probably he's as close to to that as you can get. Pele, Socrates, those kinds of players are all connected very spiritually to the game as a result of their culture.
And I think you mentioned as well this idea of being culturally programmed. Oh, you're also being culturally programmed away from living in the present, right? Because well, not almost. You are, because we're looking at screens. We're disconnected, right? People are now at rock concerts or football matches, right? Keep on football. They hold up the thing when the thing's happening. They're not in the moment. They're outside looking in, right?
Egoic.
Right.
Guys,
and it's tricky.
I just have to apologize. I have to get to a game, but I just want to thank Owen for your time. I really appreciate the conversation.
You too, man. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Alex.
Take care, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, we've been a while.
Jesus, look at the time.
I should probably get a move on soon.
I think it's fair to say we've
5 minutes ago.
I think it's fair to say we've dropped into a collective flow state then.
Yeah, absolutely. That is cool. But look, I can kind of indicate from my perspective, I'm much more of a practitioner than a theorist, but ultimately, my deep interests in sport are ultimately all down to how you make other people and yourself feel good about being a part of it in the first place. And that's the kick-ass thing about football, is if you can make that happen, it's something that lives with you for life. You're in love with it forever. And I think major issues at the moment is there are too many coaches way too fixated on the fixed things, the things that ultimately can't be really pushed any further. The analytics of tactics can only really be pushed to the geography of the game, or the geometrics of the game. In reality, coaching stretches way above and beyond the context of that, because you actually have an opportunity to impact individuals on a human level, and that's where I see where I have the most fun as a coach, anyways.
Love it.
Yeah. Well, that's a cool way. That's the
conversations like this, for example.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's cool. I share a lot of that. I think I agree with you. Cool. I think it's great, and really fun to talk to you. So thanks
for no, I appreciate your time as well, guys. And
it's been really fun. Yeah.
If you decide you want to have me on, which I can understand you wouldn't because of the constant talking, then please come and find me again.
Yeah, we will. Awesome.
Okay.
Okay. Cheers,
right.
Owen. Thank
See you
you.
guys.
care.
Take care. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye. You want to stay on, David? Yeah, you're there.
Yeah, I'm still on. I'm just cutting off the recording now. I think it's just me and you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hold on.